Hello, everyone. I am so happy to join you this evening to talk a little bit about wargame design. I'm very thankful for Sebastian for offering this invitation and for the Goose, which I didn't know you had such a clever way to say that name for having me on to chat a little bit about this topic. I am always eager for opportunities to speak beyond the scope of just doing my own design work. I am the creative director at Leader Games, which is a mid-sized game company. I used to say a small game company, but we have about 15 or 16 people on staff. So I guess we've arrived at mid-size. I'm the creative director at Leader Games. It's based in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I am the co-founder with my brother of Wehrlegig Games, which is a historical game imprint. And most of my design writing, thinking, and time is spent in the practice of making games. These are some of the games that I've worked on over the last several years, probably most famously Root, and then we have Oath. Those are both games from Leader Games, and then Pamir and John Company are designs that I have worked on and published through Whirligig. And I adore working on these projects. They take a long time. Every project that you see on that screen took at least a year, some of them many, many years to work on. But I don't often get a chance to talk about design questions that are larger than my own work. So whenever someone asks if I'd like to come talk about design, my general policy is to say yes. Now, that doesn't stop me from being slightly uncomfortable with this teaching assignment. I don't consider myself a wargame designer properly, although um, I don't really have a good explanation for why. I think sometimes when push comes to shove, I come up with very old-fashioned definitions of wargaming, but more particularly, I'm uncomfortable with it because the games that I work on view the conflict they simulate from a very healthy distance. They're fundamentally cultural, social, economic games, or political. Conflict is, of course, part of those stories, but the games aren't investing a lot of energy in modeling that. However, despite that, I am a lifelong student and player of war games. I spend a lot of time thinking about conflict modeling and simulation, and I try to apply some of the lessons that I see in that discipline to my own work. In fact, sometimes I think I owe basically my entire design career to the fact that I happen to pay attention to wargame designers, and I try to apply some of the lessons and theories and best practices to slightly more mass market games. Now, what I want to do today is talk a little bit about um, the subject of perspective in game design. And this is both a very precise and a huge topic because there are a lot of different ways that we can approach perspective when we're doing game design. And there are many ways it can inform the sorts of designs that get produced. And yet, compared to things like, I don't know, the character of an ammunition type or the slope of a hill, perspective sometimes gets short shrift. And so, what I want to do is spend today thinking a little bit about design generally and the kind of assumptions we make about design. I'll talk a little bit about wargaming history, and we'll fold in sort of my own work and think about how that work engages with the subject of perspective. And then I'll offer a few lenses that anyone can use in their own work or in reacting to a game to think about the sorts of assumptions that a game is making about the perspective of its players, and also how engaging with perspective can have some real benefits for our design practice. There will be plenty of time, I'll say right at the start, for questions at the end. So please feel free to take notes and drop those in, as Sebastian noted, to the chat log, and we'll make sure to get to them. All right. So we might start by asking ourselves why perspective is something that we need to talk about at all. It seems very obvious that when you approach a war game, you are coming at it uh, to embody a historical counterpart or a present day counterpart, and that embodying will engage with perspective. Now, one thing that I want to start with right at the start is that the reason why perspective seems very obvious is because there is a assumption of perspective, and that assumption comes from our own engagement with games. And I'm thinking here of something as traditional as a game like chess. Now, if you think about what chess is, uh, Both players can visualize the entire board, the entire grid. The character of that board is completely understood by the players. In fact, you need to understand the board in order to play the game. The pieces on the game are simple. There are several classes of pieces. They have particular kinds of rules. There are a couple troublesome exceptions to those rules, and the objectives are cleared in the case of chess, symmetrical as well. Now, this is a hard-won truth of any kind of analog gaming. And I really want to just emphasize that a little bit because games don't necessarily have to look like this, but they do. And there's a wonderful Assyriologist and historian named Irving Finkel who's written a lot about the history and development of games in antiquity up into the modern era. And he has this amazing distinction between what he calls good games and bad games. And Irving Finkel talks about some games that were designed in monastic settings that were outstandingly, they had an outstanding level of complexity to them. Lots of little rules. You had to know at least a few classical languages to even play them. They were filled with lots of little jokes about theology. And no one knows the names of these games or plays them because they were so directed at their own situation, at their own moment in history, that they were very difficult to teach or to transmit in any way. These are, for Irving Finkel, bad games. In contrast, a good game is a game that is easy to teach, easy to replicate. It has usually fewer rules. And there's something in its design that is compelling. And you can tell if a good game is good because you can look at the influence that it's had and you can look at its spread. And so a classic example of a Irving Finkel style good game would be something like chess. Here's a game that develops over basically 1,000 years. It crosses most of Eurasia and beyond. At every step of the way, it is being modified, taught, adjusted. It's adapting to lots of different settings. It's a plastic thing, these games. And the characteristics that make it good are worth discussing. I mean, it's one thing to describe chess as being a good game, but it's another thing to think about what are the core elements that actually make it good. And those elements are actually common in a lot of older games. So here we have a selection of old games, checkers, of course, Mancala, Pachisi, which is like the kind of prototypical ancient race game, later kind of rebranded and marketed as Parcheesi. And there are commonalities in these. We have simple piece classes, simple boards. In fact, in some cases, the game isn't coming in a set at all. Oftentimes the really good games can be drawn with a stone on some kind of hard surface, and you can use any kind of proxy pieces to play them. Um, the reason these games are good is because a person could experience the game and easily remember it. And then later in life, they might have, maybe they were a soldier on campaign, maybe they were a refugee, maybe they were a prisoner. And in a different corner of their life, they're able to communicate this game or teach it. And thus the game moves and transmits. Now, this doesn't seem like it has much to do with wargaming. And we're going to get to wargaming pretty shortly. But there already are some baked in assumptions about how games can work. Players should be able to view the entire board when they sit down to play a game. Players should understand the movement of each other's pieces because how am I going to remember how to teach the game to my, grandchild, maybe several decades later? How am I going to be able to do that if I have to memorize a different set of rules for every player? Now, I assure you in this regard, Root classifies as a bad game with a capital B. And there are reasons why almost every game produced today or designed today would qualify as a bad game, and why I doubt any of them make it through the century, let alone a millennia. But that's okay because not all art needs to live that long. So you see in early war games, and this is of course, classic images of the Kriegspiel. You see basically the same kind of conventions, regulated maps, simple components, all those starting to develop with a level of complexity. This is like a Royal Kriegspiel set, so it's not a great example of this trend. But in the early efforts to war game, people are thinking about chess. They're thinking about checkers. They're thinking about ways of designing and using traditional game forms to model something that is more complex than a traditional game. And that's the key thing. Now, this starts to change when we arrive in the 20th century. And the biggest thing that changes is we have the availability of relatively inexpensive print infrastructure and mass production infrastructure so that you can design a game that instead of just being a set of rules or a set of pieces, actually combines both. And they're both going to be placed in a box. And that box is going to include pieces that might have been pasted on some kind of cardstock or cardboard and then die cut into smaller pieces. Now, you don't get these things without a really robust economic infrastructure that's going to allow people to produce these games. You also don't get these games unless you have the minimum climate controls that are going to allow a paper product, a box of cardboard basically, to be able to sit on a shelf and not disintegrate after a few seasons. But in the mid 20th century, these things are ever more common, and so we start to see games. So that's changing the goalposts a little bit. If I don't have to know and memorize all the rules to a game in order for it to be good, well, what makes a game good? And in the case of the early Charles S. Roberts war games, what made it good is that the player, you, could be in command of a quote realistic war game. And the realism was an important part of what the game could offer. Um, it's, I think, really difficult to understate the degree to which this was an innovation. Because for all of human history up to this point, games are pedagogical devices. They're devices of play. They are not devices that are trying to model anything specifically. Now, they can have resonances. I mean, chess and card games, for instance, are often used in metaphor. We see it in poetry and plays all over the place. People talk about, you know, capturing a queen, winning a trick. These have resonances in lots of different corners of our lives, but it's working at metaphor. And here, now that we have the ability to produce rules more effectively, and we can direct more, I'm just going to call it institutional expertise. Now that we can direct more of those things towards understanding something and then produce an object, a kind of model in a box, well, we can start making games about more than just metaphor. And here out too, I mean, and this isn't a talk about the Kriegspiel, but I should also mention like the American game Strategos, and there are tons of these that start coming out of the late 19th century and into the 20th. Okay, so this trend towards realism, the game is offering a better and better model. It just keeps going. And as the 20th century wears on, we get titles of increasing complexity, even to a kind of an apotheosis in the early 1980s with the Campaign for North Africa and things like the Advanced Squad Leader. Now, I'll talk about Advanced Squad Leader first. From this perspective, a perspective that prioritizes, I'm not going to call it realism, I'm going to call it model completeness, which is a little different. Squad Leader is not a realistic game, really, by most accounts. I don't think that's a controversial statement at all. But Squad Leader does aspire to a kind of completeness. And any player who plays Advanced Squad Leader knows about the dreaded or delightful Chapter H in their rule books, the ever-expanding chapter that includes, rules for obscure Italian half tracks and all sorts of little minutia so that the system can model any squad level engagement in that rough period. And for the younger folks here who might not know, the Advanced Squad Leader rules, basically they're one of the most amazing editorial efforts. They're almost like the OED for wargaming, where Avalon Hill looked at all of these modules of Squad Leader and the Squad Leader line, which would have been a runaway success, and they decided to do a tremendous editorial overhaul and collapse everything into a single unified framework. It's one of the great editorial stories of wargaming. And not only did they produce it in one framework, well, not only did they help uh, collect everything under one umbrella, they also had the foresight to include something like a rules binder, which you see here. And that thing, what you're looking at in this image is the hard case and binder that would house all the rules so that as new content was added to the system, you could unclip the binder and stick in more rules. This is a desire for model completeness, and it's a desire that's now being built into the products themselves. Now, I always feel funny for talking about Richard Berg's Campaign for North Africa because this game is half a joke. It's almost a parody of the desire for complexity, realism, model completeness. It's, the SPI tagline reads at the top, a super detailed, right, intensively real, specifically decide, intensive simulation, specifically designed for maximum realism. And you can read that with excitement if you have a certain cast of mind. You could read that as a joke, which I think it was a little bit of a joke, or you could just read that with terror as a player of games. Now, the thing is, these endeavors are fascinating, and there's a lot to learn about them, but that they are prioritizing a level of they're prioritizing their model of conflict simulation over every other element of the game form. This is the main thing. Now, as we move into the late 1980s, there is a division in wargaming, and I'm being a little simplistic here, but you start to see, because of the tremendous complexity of these titles, more and more titles move into digital game spaces. And so here we have Computer Bismarck, widely considered kind of the first war game that was done digitally. Even something like Panzer General from the mid 90s, which was a lighter war game, but still an effort to have some kind of black box, the computer handle all that complexity so the players could be just facing the actual decisions on the ground, or as it was imagined. Um, Now, computer games, because you are powered, you have access to a computer, they can handle models of tremendous complexity, and this just continues to ratchet up. And I think it finds maybe its highest point in the paradox strategy games. If you're familiar, here's a screenshot from Victoria 3 and from Stellaris. By some accounts, outside of maybe Civilization, the most successful computer strategy games on the market right now are produced by Paradox. And they take your quad core processor and your nice graphics card, and they apply those energies towards outrageous feats of modeling. In Stellaris, you can zoom through, dozens, hundreds of little star systems with just a few clicks. Victoria 3, the game pictured on the left, has this somewhat outrageous claim that every single person alive in the 19th century is modeled inside the game. Now, that, again, a little bit like the campaign from North Africa, reads a little bit like a joke to me, because of course I could write a number on a piece of paper and say this number captures every human who was alive in the 19th century. It's in some way, but there is a seriousness which you can read in the Victoria 3 designer diaries, where they talk about what it means to simulate a person, a people, a nation, an empire, and also all of the materials that go along with it. You see the commodities move through all the different, systems. Now, this, I will just say, brings to mind some interesting problems, which is, obviously a computer can allow you to see an entire empire, right? You can see all the star systems arrayed, but how does the empire actually see? And what does it see when it looks? And as someone with a background in history and literary studies, and who spent a lot of time digging around in archives, I found in my own thinking about games this growing dissonance, where I started thinking about the apparatus of wargaming, the UI and the rules and all the models and everything. I thought it was very compelling and very interesting, but it wasn't reflecting the actual material reality of the people on the ground in a way that took into account their own subject position. I sometimes will tell people who don't play war games that studying war games can feel a little bit like studying chemistry, because there are rules and there are logics that lurk between underneath the rules. And so you kind of learn the rules. These two things, this is going to happen if you combine them. And then when you get to an advanced chemistry class, you start learning like, oh, because of the ionic bonds, that's the reason why this is happening this way. And war game rules can feel like that. There are all these logics and sublogics. But sometimes you get so deep in the model that you actually forget who you are supposed to be actually playing, what agency you're inhabiting. And as I was thinking about Victoria 3, I was reminded of this sort of famous puzzle that concerns the British East India Company. So the British East India Company is, by some accounts, the most powerful private corporation public-private corporation, I should say, that ever existed. It may have been the most profitable. It certainly managed the most people, um, and uh, and no one doubts the role it had in transforming the world. But the British East India Company also has this awful little secret among many awful open secrets. And the awful secret was that it was headquartered in this building. This is the East India House. It was headquartered in this building for almost 100 years. Um, a pretty modest building. In fact, people would walk by it and not even realize what they were looking at, especially, which is especially concerning given that there's a big ship with a sail and those two large finials up there. But they didn't know, and it was just too modest. It had, by some accounts, basically 5 windows across from left to right, depending on how you counted them. At various points, staffed by under a dozen people, or sometimes a couple dozen. And for all that, it controlled this vast empire. Now, how did it manage that? Well, it had a huge body of underpaid and unpaid interns slash shareholders who weren't employees on the books, but who did a lot of the work of governance and organization. So it was really, if you've ever been on an academic committee, know that you too could have been powerful, part of the largest corporation in the world. It was the same kind of committee work. But more importantly, the East India Company operated the way it did through rules, through ideas, and through regulations. So it didn't have the power to enforce that you could really do your paperwork well, but it could make, but it still had enough power to encourage people to do it. And the East India Company was very good at tracking information. So every ship, every deal that was made under its auspices was recorded and tracked. All the cargo and its movement tracked. And over the course of its 200 odd years of existence, it amassed a massive archive, a huge archive. It's housed these days at the British Library, the East India Archive. And I think it's in these stacks. I can't, this is the best picture I could find. I've been there and it's in different places. Um, and it's amazing. And you can leaf through the letters and the tables that it drums up, and you can think, my God, no wonder they were such a dominant force in Southeast Asia. They had all this information about the world. And that is a little bit of a fib because, in point of fact, they didn't. In fact, one thing that is abundantly clear when you get really deep into the archive is that the East India Company, while it was gathering all this data, it wasn't actually using it. In fact, this data that formed the East India Company's archive wasn't properly synthesized until the late 1970s by K.N. Chowdhury, who wrote The Trading World of Asia and the English East India Company. Now, this is a really important book because it was the first effort, well, not the first effort, it was the first successful effort to synthesize all of the information about the East India Company. And much to do is made in the early prefaces of the book about the computer models and like, oh, and of course, this is work done on computers in the 1970s. And so, talked about how expensive all the tables were to concoct. But from this book, you get this fantastic picture of the trading world in, basically international trade in and around India and the other East India Company areas in the 18th century. If you were to collate this information with the Dutch East India Company's records, there's a good argument that could be made that we know more about international trade in the 18th century than any other century up until our present moment, potentially. And that has a lot to do with the things that get regulated, not regulated. But it is an outrageous, amazing corpus that is still being sifted through and sorted so that we can understand a full picture of what Indian economics looked like at this time. And for on that same purpose, what British and Western economics look like. In fact, you can see in this text the Industrial Revolution play out almost like a photo negative as you look at the different commodities move in and out of the UK. So, faced with this huge body of information, a body that looks like Victoria 3, but also the failure of understanding what was going on. How are we to put this in a game? How are we to model this? So I did my best in a game that came out a couple of years ago. This is John Company, second edition. The first edition was published in 2018. No, 2017. Well, it came out in the winter, the 2017-2018 winter. And I was lucky enough to have the chance to revise the game and make a much more fully featured edition in from about 2020 to 2023, or 2022. Uh, this design had an interesting challenge, which is I needed to think hard about the perspective that I wanted to give players and how that perspective would warp their sense of the game. So I'm going to start with this little letter. There are a lot of letters I wanted to pick, but I picked this one. This letter has to do with military appointments, and it um, it's sort of like, and you can see the little check marks. Someone is saying like, "Hey, these are the places where I want you to kind of stash these people," and someone gets the letter and they're checking off each little name. And you get a lot of letters like this when you look in the East India Company archives. A lot of like small requests, little bits of nepotism, people asking for favors. And that's a big part of the story. And so as I was working on the game, I thought a lot about information delay. The fundamental perspective of a shareholder of the East India Company who was looking to, and maybe double their investment was that they didn't know what was going on. So that meant if I was going to make a game about the East India Company, I had to capture the distance between London and Bombay. And to do this, I tried to have it resonate at basically every level of the design. So you'll see here that like the map of India is kind of shoved off to the right of the board, and on the left we have all the things that concern London. Um, you have these estates that are kind of like in and around England and Wales and Scotland, and then you have the London season display, all these like charts and numbers about the company's standing, its debt. Those are all on the left. That's on the London side. And then on the right, we have India. And India uses a different art style, uses commissioned paintings that are done in a kind of Ganjifa style, which is an Indian trick-taking game. Um, there are values on those orders, but the Indian map is meant to look different, look alien, look like a world apart, because to the people in London, it was a world apart. And then connecting them, we have a ribbon. And this ribbon is used to resolve the order of operations in the game. And it begins with the operation of the family on the left side, and then it goes to these portrait ovals with these little icons on them. And every icon is an office in the East India Company. The chairman acts, the director of trade acts, the manager of shipping acts. And when you take actions, you are only operating in a very small world where you can only take certain types of actions. And as we move through that ribbon, we start to get to offices that act in India. This means as chairman, you are making decisions about, in the case of John Company, budgeting, but you're directing money towards India, and you aren't going to find out about how India does until later in the turn. And this is just recognizing the 3 to 6 month delay that most communications had at this period. So that's one way that I wanted the perspective of the players to influence the shape of the design. There's another way too, though, which is I had to pick who I wanted the players to be. I often tell people that when you're working on historical game design, there's really just two questions you have to answer, and they're the most important questions. And the first question you have to answer is who are the actors? Who has agency? Who has the ability to make decisions within the space of the game? Okay, those are your players. Good. That's the first question. The second question is what do they care about? What are the things that animate them? What are they trying to achieve? And that is how you get to the victory condition. And all the mechanisms of the game, everything else is suspended between those two questions. Those are the essential things. So, who are the characters in this game? Well, as a student of Empire, one thing that was always very frustrating to me about the East India Company is how incoherent it is. When you learn about the British Empire, it's very easy to read a Kipling poem or something an imperial theorist was writing in the late 19th century, and to think to yourself, oh, the British Empire, it was acting with a single mind. It had all these agendas. It had these things it was trying to do. It's Livingston's 3 or 4 C's of civilization or whatever. But when you actually look at the record, it's much more confusing. And it's confusing because the East India Company wasn't one person with one goal acting. It was a lot of people acting against with cross purposes and in their aggregate actions producing essentially the seed of what became kind of official policy. So I needed then a way of telling that story, and the way to tell that story was to think about, well, who had agency? Well, you had people like Clive had agency, and certainly people like the early directors of the company and the governors and Hastings and the early chairman. So if those people have agency, what's guiding them? Well, they weren't alone. They weren't islands. They were operating through family connections, and they were being influenced by their families and, of course, by their own desires. And then collectively, they were producing the policy of the company. So, all right, the actors of our game, these are the people who are trying to use the East India Company to change, to basically make money. I mean, and what were their specific goals? They wanted financial, social, and cultural security in the context of their domestic life in England. When Clive returns after the Battle of Plassey, having transformed the nature of the company, having secured an impossible amount of wealth, the first things he does are to, purchase a large castle, to enrich his family, and to try to move up in domestic society. Those were his goals. His goal wasn't to conquer India. His goal was to become a peer of the realm. And so the victory conditions in this game reflect that. On the left-hand side, on the farthest side from India, we have some very large, fancy houses. Your little player pieces are trying to move through that ribbon and get to those large houses. That is what the game is about. But I needed to make sure that players um, this is an icky position to put players in. And so I was trying to think about the appropriate perspective for them to portray themselves. And I ended up using a novelistic approach that really elevated the kind of satire and cartoon nature of the British Empire and of English culture more generally. The spouses pictured on the cards are uniformly pretty ugly folks with pretty distorted features, and these are your prizes. These are the highest prizes in the world. The little temples, not temples, but the little fort pieces that you're tearing down in India with metal flags, and they're much more beautiful than anything you're going to be winning with what you use with the funds that you gain. The political system in the game features this prime minister wheel. Like a lot of the art, this is coming from a cartoon by Gilray. And I wanted players to realize that the British had an art, like almost a sense of humor about themselves, and that there was also a grotesqueness to their actions that they were certainly aware of even at that moment. And so that's a sense of how like questions of perspective start to warp basically every little element of a model as you work to build it out. Now, I want to talk next about Pax Pamir, and this section includes some ideas that I've adapted from a GDC talk that is so buried in the vault, and I'm so sad that it's buried in the vault that I decided to bring it up, and also because it deals directly with questions of perspective in game design. So this is Pax Pamir. This is a game that was originally designed in 2015, I think it was published, and then it was republished in, I think, 2019, although I could be wrong. The first game that my brother and I did with our new imprint. And it concerns the formation of the modern Afghan state in the 19th century. But it took a long time for me to figure out how to say that thesis succinctly. So I had wanted to make a game about a period in the 19th century called the Great Game for a long time. The Great Game, which is a slightly tricky term, and I'll tease out some of those difficulties a little bit later, was a geopolitical contest that occurred between the Russian Empire and the British Empire via the British East India Company and the Foreign Office over the course of kind of the long 19th century. It's a coda to the Napoleonic Wars in the same way that the Cold War can be read as a coda to the Second World War in the 20th century. And it was always a period that fascinated me for lots of reasons. It had to do with the limits of empire. It engaged with a, you know, the big my sense of the beginning of what we would call proxy wars. Um, it also dealt with the emergence of a lot of nation states in Central Asia. So it was touching on a lot of issues that I thought was fascinating. And I was also interested in it because of its remoteness. If I'm being honest, there was something about the Great Game that interested me because it was so different from any history that I had ever read. And I had encountered this book. Um, by Peter Hopkirk called The Great Game. Peter Hopkirk was a journalist who wrote this amazing book. It reads like a novel, a spy thriller, and it's filled with colorful characters like this Alexander Burns, who was like a brilliant Orientalist in the sense that he was deeply interested in Eastern culture and language. And he was also a bit of a rapscallion and a cad. And he went on this really great adventure. And I couldn't help but thinking as I was reading his own writing and Hopkirk's writing about Alexander Burns that he was a little bit like a James Bond figure in the 19th century. And I liked Twilight Struggle. And I thought to myself, well, if the Cold War can have Twilight Struggle, is there a way to make a game about the Great Game that moves it into the 19th century? And I'm a Victorianist by training, so of course I want to pull things into my own period. Unfortunately, I was a big dummy and really misunderstood who the proper agents, who the proper actors were in this story. And I'll illustrate that by telling a kind of micro narrative. So there's this man named Charles Stoddart, he's a diplomat, and he was interested in freeing slaves, particularly Russians who had been enslaved by the emir, the leader of Bukhara. And that was a man by the name of Nasrullah Khan, who ruled Bukhara, which was a city state, one of the kind of enclave Khanate states, and or little Khanates, I should say. And he had been getting slaves from the frontiers of Russia. And Charles Stoddart wanted to go talk to him about it. And what a dummy Charles Stoddart was. He was thrown in prison. Shortly thereafter, his personal friend, Arthur Connolly, who he had met once or twice, came in and decided he was going to rescue his best buddy. Arthur Connolly is actually the person who potentially is the person who originates the phrase "the Great Game" to describe this whole region. And they both end up in prison. And they're in prison, and there's a report that they're in prison. And a few years later, this character, Joseph Wolf, former converted Jewish preacher, kind of an itinerant preacher who would travel around, had traveled all through the Holy Land, had written some books about it. He got it in his head that he should be the one to save Charles Stoddart and Arthur Connolly. And so he set about on an epic journey that would cross Central Asia. He got into all kinds of trouble. And when he got to Asia, he found out that Charles Stoddart and Arthur Connolly had been killed much earlier than even he had left. I think they were dead by the time he set foot on his adventure. And Nasrullah Khan looked at this odd character and threw him in jail for a while. And then eventually Joseph Wolf leaves. He's able to leave. Luckily, I mean, this is the luckiest man alive. He stumbles out there unbelievably. And I thought, oh, what? This is a great story. It's got rescue. It's got people, dying and heroically. But as I thought about it, I realized, why do I care about this story? Well, I care about it because it's fulfilling some kind of weird adventure fantasy. Like this isn't the actual story. If I'm thinking about the Great Game and I'm thinking about what the Great Game actually means, there's really only one character in this whole story who had any agency, and that's Nasrullah Khan. That's the player who has some kind of agency. Now, this led me to doing a lot of extended reading on and reframing my thoughts. So I kind of dropped the spy novels, the Flashmen, and I went to read Christine Noel's brilliant State and Tribe in Afghanistan, William Dalrymple's recent, much more recent Return of a King, and I looked a lot at period histories, including the Shrazal Tarika, that is the kind of courtly history of Das Muhammad in the years after it. Thankfully in translation. Um, these books changed my sense of the period. It made me realize that the primary actors in this period were not intelligence agents. They were local arrays of political leaders who had arranged themselves in sort of power blocks. And what they were trying to do was fill the vacuum that had been left by the collapse of what's called the Durrani Empire, a kind of proto-Afghan state. And, so we've got maybe a power block that's more based in Persia, and there's maybe another one that's more based in what today would be modern Pakistan. And then, of course, there are many power blocks based in Afghanistan. These are the essential actors, and what they need is the material of state formation. So this is a famous scene of the inside of the Bala Hissar court palace in Kabul, and the players are the power brokers, and they're working with political actors, some of which might be players, some of which might not. And those intelligence agents, all those people I was so infatuated with, they're peripheral agents. They're peripheral characters. So now I came to this essential question of perspective, which is if our players are power brokers, how do they see the terrain of the contest in front of them? And the way I went about sorting through this was to use a PAX style framework. And we'll talk more about PAX style games in a little bit. But the PAX framework basically says there is, instead of drawing cards from a deck, there is a market, a 2x6 array of cards. And these represent the personalities, the pawns in the game, right? Maybe it's fruit markets, maybe it's Jean-Francois Allard, maybe it's some sharpshooters, maybe it's the Ark of Bukhara, which is an ancient old fortress in Bukhara. These are things that players can fight over. Now, how do they fight over them? Well, in the game, players have a currency. They're just called rupees, but they represent, and this is very critical, political capital. And the game's system of political capital is largely zero sum, which is to say, if one player expends a lot of political capital, other players are going to find themselves with more political capital. And this is because I wanted to show the ebb and flow of political exchange. If a party extends itself too far, the other parties are going to be benefiting from it in terms of potential actions. Now, the way this works in the game is when you buy things from the market, you'll see those values above those rows. Um, this image is a little cut off, but that 3 represents that it's the third numbered row, I guess the fourth row. So there are 3 rows in front of it. And when you buy that card, which costs 3 coins, you have to put 1 coin on every card in front of that card. So if you want Jean-Francois, you've got to put 3 coins on that market. Those coins sitting on the cards, when other players buy other cards, they will take those coins. So as players expend their political capital, the political capital sits on the market and other players can take it up. And there's lots of different things that players do with their political capital in Pamir. And also, how did they see the world? What was the visual language of it? Well, on the map, mostly the map is visualizing the 3 different coalitions. The game builds itself into these coalitions. There's a Russian-backed coalition, a British-backed coalition, and an Afghan-backed coalition, which here are imagined through the yellow, pink, and green blocks. The blocks themselves are designed to mimic traditional abstract games of the period and region. They're kind of stonish in their presentation. And the map, and this is the really important thing, the map looks nothing, at least to our eyes, like a map of Central Asia. I should have done a direct comparison, but I'm just going to do that. I'm going to commit that sin of going back and forth really fast. So if you look at this map here, this is basically, not quite, but it's very similar to the map that is in Pamir. But the map in Pamir is twisted and distorted to reflect the most important regions of the game. So you see, for instance, we have the Transcaspia, which is the kind of stretch of land through Orenburg up by the Caspian Sea that goes into Russia. And then we have Persia, that's a large political region on the edge. On the other side of the map, we have the Punjab, right, Northwest India. And then for Afghanistan is really seen as just 3 regions, Kabul, Herat, and Kandahar. Those regions are, of course, named for cities because a lot of the power politics in Afghanistan had a very tight relationship to these cities. These are the major pieces of currency. And so I wanted, again, this map isn't a totally spatially correct map, although if you line it up and tilt it the right way and do a little bit of scale controls, you can get something that looks quite close. But I wanted something that reflected the imagination of the player's historical counterparts. Okay. So, with all that said, I want to move into a little bit of a design practicum, right? So I want to think about um, taking those two big case studies and distilling them into three different lenses for thinking about how we treat perspective in our games. And the thing that I'm going to say here, and I'll say it at the end too, is that we oftentimes, when we're working on war games and any kind of serious game, and what I mean by serious game is a game that is trying to say something, and maybe it's trying to communicate something to the State Department, maybe it's trying to communicate something about history to a student in a pedagogical setting. There are lots of different uses for a game, but if you have a game that's trying to communicate something, you're going to be investing energy in figuring out what's the correct range of these weapons. What's the correct way to map this terrain onto a system of terrain effects? But questions of perspective matter a lot too. And I have some specific examples that we'll get into, but I just want the same effort that we spend thinking about the range of weapons should also be spent thinking about what are the perspectives of the historical actors? How did they see the world, and how should their subjectivity inform the model that we're presenting? So let's start by talking about action potential. So here we have two games. On the left is Memoir 44 by Richard Borg, and on the right is Confusion by someone whose name I've just forgotten. That's too bad. Now, Memoir, both of these games do the exact opposite thing with their action potential. So I thought it'd be lovely to stick them next to each other. In Memoir, you fully understand your own capabilities in the short term, but not in the long term. So players have the battlefield is divided into these like three sections, a center and two flanks. And then you have action cards, which if you could zoom in, you would see they're going to they're going to make certain numbers of unit activations in each of the three flanks. So I know what I can do in the short term. I don't know which cards I'm going to be drawing to replace the cards that I have, but I have full knowledge of my own unit strengths. I do not know the unit strengths of not the unit strengths. I do not know the action potential of my opponent. And so a lot of the game is about teasing out that action potential and also trying to make moves which will be rewarded by your random draws from the deck. Now, when the battles of World War II were happening, nobody was grabbing a hand of cards and saying like, oh gosh, I wish I would have drawn another Omaha Beach card. I really need to do that activation. But it is modeling a kind of command chaos and a kind of priority, and it's starting to capture the perspective of being uncertain when certain things are going to happen. Now, on the right, we have Confusion. This is an abstract game that got kind of themed as a Cold War spy game. And you'll see the pieces are really clever. So we have these little Bakelite bricks, these like kind of plasticky bricks, and they have two sides. One side has a symbol. So you see we have some sunglasses, a radiation symbol, a trench coat, all sorts of Cold War ephemera, and a little letter. That's like its ID. It's like Agent Sunglasses. But on the other side, there is a little notch. And inside that notch is a movement brick, which tells you how your piece can move. And the key thing is that you do not know how your own pieces are going to move when you play a game of Confusion. You only know how your opponent's pieces are going to move. Now, in the center of the game is a briefcase, and your objective is to get the briefcase and get it back to your side. And critically, when you move the piece, your opponent will tell you if you've made a correct move. And so you are trying to suss out your own operational capacity as you play the game. And it really wonderfully captures the uncertainty of action potential that one imagines is felt by spy masters the world over. There's another really good game that has been recently republished called Conspiracy, which does something very similar, where players don't have any pieces and you are always allowed to move any piece you'd like on a board. Or you can make bids on who actually controls that piece. And if you move a piece and a player doesn't want you to move that piece, they can reveal how much they've bid on it or a portion of that bid to cancel the move. And again, it captures the uncertainty of action potential. And it's not just doing it because it's a neat mechanism, or maybe it is doing it because it's a neat mechanism, but it's a neat mechanism that can be applied to a matter of subjectivity. Now, there's another example of this, and this is from what has become like one of my favorite wargaming series. This is from Kevin Zucker's Library of Napoleonic Battles. And it is probably I think it has a claim to be the oldest continuously supported wargaming platform out there, or design series. There were some service interruptions in the 90s, but basically you're looking at just one of the most established wargaming systems out there. It's very traditional. Um, and it has this a really amazing set of command rules. And basically, it locates you as a commander. I don't have the command. Oh, there, the Grouchy here is pictured. I'll use my cursor. He's right here by Talu. Um, and he has a number of activations that he can make listed on his little piece, and he has a range of 10 hexes that he can act in. But if a unit is outside of that range or can't receive one of the activations, they can roll to see if they act of their own initiative. And so Dumeric over here, he's in the swamp. He has his own initiative, and you can make a roll to see if you're allowed to move him. Now, this is tremendously frustrating to a lot of wargame players because they'll be like, no, like he has got orders, he's got to go there. And the activation captures a lot of things. Like maybe Dumeric is moving, he's just moving in the wrong direction. Maybe he's lost. Maybe he slept in that morning. You don't have the ability to follow up and to make sure the orders are going precisely according to plan. Now, this system, I'll mention too, just on the subjects of maps, which is where we're going to go next. It uses a really interesting scale, and there's a lot of debates in Napoleonic war games about what the appropriate scale is to capture Napoleon's own thinking about the battles. So, for instance, if you did a squad level, quote unquote squad level, not really a scale that exists in Napoleonics for good reason. If you did a kind of like micro tactical treatment of Waterloo, and you're trying to do it to capture some genius of Wellington or Napoleon, it would be laughable because that's not the scale at which their genius or what was expressed. And Kevin Zucker, after a lot of study, really likes this scale, which is about 500 yards per hex. Every turn is an hour, and you'll play like the day before the battle, and you'll kind of do the approach to battle and then into the battle itself. And that, of course, is going to inform how the maps are going to look and everything like that. But critically, even in a hex encounter war, a very traditional hex encounter war game, you still see command uncertainty, action potential uncertainty. Another system that does this really well is the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War. It does a great job with command uncertainty. Okay, so action potential, that's lens one. Oh yeah, we'll talk about that later. We'll talk about Kevin Zucker's quote later. Forgot I moved up the slide. Okay, let's talk about maps. So another way to express subjectivity is by thinking about the kind of maps you're presenting your players with. This map for Virgin Queen, when it came out, there were some players who were a little upset by it. I think a lot of people liked it. It's by Mark McCaffrey. And I think most players really enjoyed what this map was doing. Ed Beach, the designer, described it as the world in the mind of Philip II, which I thought was a really amazing way of describing it, because you didn't want to capture, you didn't need a fixed scale to capture how this person was thinking of the world. You needed some way of distorting and warping the world around the subjectivity of the primary actor. Another really great use of dynamic maps is found in Upfront. This is, I think, Courtney Allen's design. This is a squad level World War II game that feels like the anti-squad leader. And it feels like anti-squad leader because you are situated in the subjectivity of an individual squad leader with no idea what you are going to encounter. So you players have to discover the map as they play the game, and there are distances to everything. So, you're approaching the wall, you're kind of like units of distance away. You get to the wall, you might, oh, there's a farmhouse there that's a little closer to the wall. You didn't know it was going to be there. Do you check out the farmhouse? There might be something in there. What's amazing about this game is it runs without a moderator. In fact, one of the things that I'm kind of leaving out of this talk on purpose is a lot of the best tools around subjectivity can be helped with the aid of a moderator. And there are lots of amazing wargaming systems, traditional wargaming systems that use moderators to create double blind scenarios and to regulate movement. For the purposes of this talk, I'm mostly interested in how players manage or how designers manage to do that without a moderator, and Upfront does it without a moderator. And then I'll just mention a design that I worked on, Oath. Oath has a very funny map, and it's a map that basically has three different types of provinces or types of sites. There are sites that are in the core, there are sites that are in the provinces, and then there are sites that are in the hinterland. And the key thing is I wanted players to realize that empires create uh, geographies and geographic logics around certain kinds of political priorities. And so things like the core are very important. It's very easy to move around between in the core. As you get into the provinces, you are as far away from the core as you are from other provinces. And then when you get to the hinterland, you are not only very far away from the core of the game, you're also far away from other things in the hinterland. And this was to give the game a kind of like truly imperial logic. And then I had to do some fancy little math stuff to collapse this map into a line when it came to how the game actually presents itself and packs up. That stuff we can talk about in questions. But all this is to say, when you are going to design a map, don't just think about, the actual distance. Think about the way that the historic counterparts engaged with space, because it may lead to a very different sense of a map. One thing, I'll go back to Virgin Queen very quickly. My favorite thing about the Virgin Queen map is the relationship between England and the Netherlands, which saw themselves as geopolitical rivals and which were about the same size in terms of like their might in various ways. In the period, leading up to the Anglo-Dutch Wars. And so I love that this map kind of like tilts Europe into it, and you kind of see these two powers like fighting over a waterway. Okay, so that is lens 2. Now let's talk about the final lens, and that lens is victory. What are the ways that the characters, the players, their historic counterparts are thinking about victory? So I want here to talk about Pax Porfiriana. So Pax Porfiriana is the first PAX game, and it uh, has this amazing victory condition, which I have used in a bunch of my designs, and which I think has had a real impact on the whole hobby and a lot of the historical games as well. Uh, in Pax Porfiriana, players play rivals who imagine themselves as the next Porfirio Diaz, the next ruler of Mexico. The thing about this political drama is that the political actors had to create very different bets, right? They're making bets about who is going to be in charge of Mexico, and they were doing that by investing in different kinds of political parties. So you have 4 different suits of victory conditions in the game. There are what are called revolution points, which are associated with Marxist movements. There are command points associated with the government. There are loyalty points, which seek to ingratiate you with to Porfirio Diaz. And then there are outrage points, which are about weaponizing U.S.-Mexican relations for your own benefit. You don't get to decide precisely which of those victory points is going to be the victory point that matters. And so the game is like you're balancing on 2 seesaws. You're trying to gain position in the condition you think is important. And then on the other side, you're trying to make sure that that position actually is going to be important. Now that might mean like trying to make sure Porfirio Diaz is in a lot of favor while you are his best friend. Or it might mean sparking a little Marxist revolt because the Marxists are in disarray and neither one of them has, a firm hand on what's going on. It directly lines up with some of the power politics during the Mexican Revolution, and it gets players thinking about um, the sorts of gambits, sacrifices, maneuvers that this political class was making at this time. Now, it doesn't capture everything. I was just spent some time with Jonathan Truitt, a Latin American historian, or historian of Latin America this weekend. And he talked about how, one of the failures of this game is that it doesn't really capture the politics of Southern Mexico. The Zapatistas are like, they're present, but they're peripheral. And that's true. It's not a perfect game by any stretch of the imagination, but it does capture something very beautifully, and it's the sense of the calculus of victory. For a more recent example of that, I adore. I just played a newer design called Prime Minister, which I thought was one of the best encapsulations of not just Victorian politics, but politics in general. And and it's just, if you want something a little bit more modern and easier to get a hold of, I would recommend Prime Minister. Okay, and then the last game I want to talk about is Triumph and Tragedy: The European Balance of Power. This is probably my favorite design on the Second World War, and it's because of how it treats the victory conditions. So basically, to win the game, you have to get 25 economic points, and you get those points by improving your economic output and also by being at peace. So you need prosperity points basically. Now, when it comes to being at peace, it's an uncertain benefit. It's the one hidden, well, it's not totally true, but it's a hidden victory condition where every turn you're at peace, you're drawing a little chip from a cup, and it's a peace dividend, and you're getting some, 0 to 2 points. But that delta is pretty big. So 5 nations who are all at peace, if everything else is the same, and some of us are drawing all zeros and some of us are drawing all twos, it doesn't take very long until our positions have diverged pretty dramatically. And then when it comes to enriching your country, all countries have or all power blocks in this case, because it's the Axis, the West, and the USSR. They have 3 resource types. They have resources, population, and industry. You always get whatever the lowest value is. So as you're playing the game, you might be playing as the Axis and you might be thinking, I want to expand my resource base. And then once you get that up, you say, I need to expand my population. And it has a way of focusing, for all the diplomatic complexity, as a way of just absolutely focusing the player's energies. Critically, though, you'll start losing the peace game. One player will always start losing the peace game. And they might look over and say, like, wow, the USSR, they've been more successful in their diplomatic overtures, or maybe the Axis has had a lot of luck, or as is most commonly the case, the West has had a lot of luck in its production and its diplomatic plays, and it looks like they're going to win on an economic victory. Then there's a second victory condition that you can engage in, and by doing this victory condition, you kind of cut yourself out of the ability to win through peace, but you have to capture 2 capitals, the kind of classic Axis and Allies style victory condition. And it's a little bit like playing a game of Twilight Struggle. And then when you're losing Twilight Struggle, you decide to transform it into a game of Risk. And what I love about it is you could play through the entire game and the war might not happen, or the war could happen early and end early. It captures the sense of possibility. I mean, one of the things about dealing with the Second World War is you look at a fellow like Chamberlain there, and it's easy to laugh at him. It's easy to say, like, how could you have not have realized what was about to happen? Well, Chamberlain wasn't alone. Most of the Foreign Office agreed with him, and a lot of diplomats, throughout Europe, even folks in Germany, didn't think the war was necessarily going to happen until it started happening. What is amazing about this game is I think it really does capture that subjectivity, that uncertainty, the sense of possibility and the unknown, and the sense of real paranoia. And I think for this reason, it is a master class in the ways that we can turn perspective into an active element of our design practice. Now, is this the best simulation of World War II? Well, for my money, it is. It's not going to capture every single facet, right? And thankfully, World on Flames is for those folks. But when you're working on a game, you can't tell every story. You can just tell one story. And that Kevin Zucker quote that I blasted by earlier in this presentation, I won't bother to go back to it now. I will. I will. It's only a couple slides away. So the, Kevin Zucker, in talking about complexity in designs, he notes that we have to be careful when we're searching for a perfect model because we're in his terms chasing a chimera. Charts and tables and dice and a grid, any game is always going to be a distortion and simplification of reality. And yet it's these distortions that make a game playable or possible. It's a delusion to think you can design without them, which is to say, we need the complexity. But at the same time, the further you pursue this, the more you're going to build a monster. And then from Zucker, however far you want to go chasing that down, at the end of the day, you're working with paper and ink and cardboard. The majority of gamers and players don't want to pursue this ideal to a point where the game stops becoming playable. And this is the key thing. And this goes back to the Irving Finkel thinking about good games and bad games. The best models, the best games are able to sit in your own mind after you're done playing them. When I'm designing games for a commercial market, I am looking for the games that players think about when they're not playing. And that means making compromises. But they're compromises to an excellent end. Because when that player comes to a moment of action, a real world situation, or if they're in a schoolroom, a test situation, or if they're a scholar and they're reading another book, in order for them to put your game in conversation with whatever the moment is presenting them with, they need to be able to hold the game in their head. And that means always making some concessions to the sorts of things that Irving Finkel calls good games, that kind of simplicity. So in conclusion, I think what I want to offer you all is the notion that when we embrace perspective in design, we have to embrace the limits of our models. So I'm not going to tell you here's a cute trick that's going to let you model early aircraft carriers well. I'm going to say think about what those aircraft carriers meant to the people on the ground and think about their operational consequences, of course. But by using the limits of the actors of your game's own reality, you can have those limits inform your own design practice and make better, simpler, and truer models for complex subjects. And that's it. I'm happy to take your questions now.
Hey Cole, we have a bunch of questions. So I'll start off with the first one, which says, when you talk about perspective and history, where do you draw the line between following history accurately or following the story you want to tell versus making some interesting mechanical versus something that is more fun to play? Like, you know what I mean? How do you stay true to history while still making a game that's enjoyable, playable, and interesting for all?
Yeah, this is a great question because for a lot of the people living the history, it's never fun, right? It's work, it's difficult, it's confusing, it's anxious. So when I'm looking for feelings, my sense is always that if I can transport players, if I can get that sense of immersion, they're going to find something enjoyable, compelling that's going to bring them back to the table, even if the experience of being at the table was completely frustrating. And here I think games that we call Euros, like economic games such as Age of Steam and the 18xx games, are really good models because there's not a fun bit of them. They are entirely about pressures. Now, there's a kind of other question embedded in there which has to do with counterfactuals. And this one is real tricky. So when I'm working on a game, I will oftentimes have a list of things that I want to to be able to happen in the game. And if it's a history game, these are things that are from the historical record. If it's a fictional game, then these are just like story beats. And I will be asking myself at various points in the design process, are those things possible in the game? Or are they not possible? And if they're not possible, I need to go in and adjust the structure of the game to allow them to happen. But I don't want to, like for instance, if I was working on a World War II game, and I'll use this as an example, I don't want the Nazis to be able to take over Washington, D.C., because I think that probably was impossible. And that's my own judgment. And a historian is going to disagree, and Philip K. Dick is going to disagree. And that's fine. But I got to put certain limits on the model that say this is the cone of possibility. And this is a place of personal aesthetics. Like my cone of possibility is going to be a little wider than some designers and a little narrower than others. And that's just part of the work. I will say when it came to John Company, we had to spend time modeling. We had an event system which powers the events in India. And I built a little model in Python with the help of a friend to basically run the Indian event system hundreds of thousands of times. And then we had another model that would sort those, kind of like a heuristic that would create like, okay, this is Mughal collapse. This is like fragmented, small states. This is rise of the Maharathan Confederacy. And I would look at it and say like, okay, well, I do know what happened historically. How likely is that to happen in John Company? And again, this is an issue of personal preference. I will say for my own designs, 10%. If the historical outcome is happening 10 to 15% of the time, that's plenty. Because the fact that we are sitting in this seminar is a bit of historical unlikeliness. And I think it's important. And the reason why I like dialing my numbers that low is I want to make sure to fill the players with the same sense of possibility that their historic counterparts had. And again, this is a place where there are limits. And if you've ever played a war game where you've had to play the doomed side, if you're playing the great campaigns, the great battles of Alexander, and you're playing anybody but Alexander, it can feel a little rough sometimes. And I think that 10% rule isn't appropriate to all situations. But it's something that I like to do for the games at the scale that I work.
So we have a very specific question. It says, what do you think about the proxy system in uh, Triumph and Tragedies like spinoff Conquest and Consequence?
It is interesting. Okay. Oh boy, this is a great question, Sebastian. It's like a hot button for me because I was just talking about conquest and consequence. I was just talking about the other day. I um like that game a lot. I think it's very well designed, very subtle, but I do not like the proxy system because it unhooks the players from their subjectivities. You have to do like it's a schizophrenic player problem. It's a little bit like Maria, where you need a player to kind of like sit in two minds. And I think for the game, it works and it has great outputs, but I do think it harms like the basic kind of simulative logic of the game. So I've mixed feelings about it. I think it is a very well designed system and it definitely outputs the right thing. I think conflict and consequence is an interesting design because I think the Pacific Theater is slightly less of a good theater to run the Triumph and Tragedy system. And I get the impulse. It makes sense to me that you would say, okay, I want to take all this good work I did and just do the other theater. But it just doesn't ring quite as true. And yeah, I guess that's also it's a brilliant design. It just doesn't like hit as hard as Triumph and Tragedy does.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say it in the sense like I've loved that system, love Triumph and Tragedy, but also at the same time, like you're playing the Soviet Union and thinking of like you are Mao at the same time. It's weird. And also the same way for the US and the KMT. Um, but yeah, I
There
get that.
there just wasn't like there was never that level of orchestration. It like
Yeah.
robs the Chinese conflict of so much of its like I mean it well you would want them almost to be other players, right? I would like rather that game were a five-player game and two players were just playing this like little game inside it. But this is just a design fantasy.
So on that note, I think that gives a follow-on question is how do you mentioned games that have like the losing side, right? And my students at Georgetown always ask me is like, how do I make a game about where one side has so many disadvantages, like it is,
Mhm.
or at least seemingly according to history? How do you have interesting decision spaces for them while creating a game?
Right. So some of this can be waved away by carefully calibrating victory conditions and thinking about what those victory conditions mean, right? So, for instance, in the context of a game about the American Civil War, you could talk about a victory condition that was designed around McClellan's presidential campaign for the South. that Southern victory is not conquering the North. It is it's ruining Lincoln's political capital so that McClellan becomes president, and then you get some kind of brokered peace. That can start to account for it, and you can use victory conditions to really creatively frame whatever the conflict is. You can also use the historical record, right? You could say, look, historically, this is what happened. Can you do better than was historical? Um, that can be pretty cold soup though. Like it's not gonna excite anyone to say, oh, I did marginally better than my historical counterpart. And I really like, I mean, as a wargamer, I like the notion of minor and major victory and kind of strategic victory and these like different gradations. One thing that I think hobby gamers are really bad at and war gamers are good at is looking at a final position and saying this position represents the play that just happened and it communicated a story. And so just sit with the story being told by this final position. And I'll give a very small kind of tangential example of this. I'm working on this game with this young designer named Joe Kelly called Molly House about queer culture in early 18th century London. And there's a mechanism in the game where if the houses, the Molly houses, which are kind of like sanctuary houses for this community, if they're raided by the Society for the Reformation of Manners, all of the players are hanged, except players who had turned informer. Now, those players who've turned informer then they score a different scoring condition, which if they score enough points, they can still win the game. In my first draft of this victory condition, I wrote that, oh, all the players who aren't informers are hanged, remove all the pawns from the scoring track, and then you can use the scoring track to record the score of the informers, which just seems very sensible to me. And Joe, my co-designer and the originator of the game, they said this isn't right because it isn't just a scoring track. It's called the joy track, and joy is the fundamental currency of the game. And when players are hanged, they shouldn't be removed from the joy track. We should like knock them over or like flip them over to their executed side. And then the informants shouldn't use that track to tally their score. They should just tally it. And I was like, we're like splitting hairs here. This doesn't seem like a reasonable way to think about this problem. And then when I played with this adjustment, it was amazing the difference it made. Because, okay, the Molly houses are rated, and a bunch of people with high joy scores are hanged. And they flip their pawns over to their executed sides. And the board state now is serving as a record of the full story, even if they lost, right? And, this falls into the same, I can extend this in the wargaming space to games that ask players to take into account like wreckage or the removal of bodies. You start telling a very different story and allowing the kind of in-game state to resonate differently if you just think about what's being captured by that in state. And that can provide a designer with tools for thinking about how to deal with losing scenarios.
So another interesting question says, is your design approach noticeably different, or, and if they are, can you say how, between designing historical games versus non-historical games?
It's different in ways that are that can be difficult to tease out on the customer side. So when I'm working on a game for Leader Games, I am trying to make an intervention in the hobby. I mean, all games are kind of utterances. We're always participating in conversations when we're designing, and that could be a conversation about the resistance in Ukraine, or it could be a conversation about what we think a fun party game might be. When I'm working with Leader Games, I am trying to make an intervention about interactive hobby games that deal with conflict. That is I'm talking about civilization games. I'm talking about narrative games. I'm talking about, quote unquote dudes on a map games. Um, and I'm trying to think about different ways we can capture that feeling. So for example, Arcs, which comes out later this year, in Arcs is a science fiction game which doesn't use any of the 4X framework. It's like it's not a 4X game. It's not interested in being a 4X game. It's also a civilization game. It's a game that tells some of those stories, but it doesn't give players full control over their peoples because states don't have full control over their people. And so it's making interventions that are historical in nature. I mean, Root is a geopolitical sandbox. I love working on the root factions, and whenever someone on staff is working on one, the questions I always ask them are the irritating ones. The like, what do you try? Like, what are the historic counterparts for this faction? What are the core texts you're using? It's not enough to just draw a bear with a tin hat and say this is a bear with a tin hat. I want it to be capturing something. And so the games for leader are very historical, but I'm working in the realm of metaphor and allowing a sort of like a duel of ages, like what happens when Hobbes and Locke fight each other, and how can I model some of the tensions that they describe in the root system. Now, when I'm working on a historical game, I have to answer to the record. The record is always kind of looming just off screen. I do most of my reading before I start working on a project, but I like to save one or two history books for the in between and after a project. So as I'm finishing my work, I can read it and realize, or I can kind of check my work against the historical record. That creates a big burden. So the history games take a really long time to make. John Company was essentially a 10-year project. Um, not the entire time wasn't active, but at least for me, I find the history games take a very long time. Lots of reading and thinking. Um, the games for leader can take a long time too, but they're long because they're more mechanically tricky to design. And that just has to do with what it means to design a game that's designed to be expanded and to exist and fight in a very competitive marketplace versus a history game, which is a little bit more um, purposeful, argumentative, and smaller in scope in terms of its intervention.
So this next question is about games that are more rigid or mechanical versus matrix or narrative games. Um, what are your thoughts about the trade-offs between when or whether to invest in the time to make more complex game models or schemas, or use more broad, open-ended, like narrative game structures for complex pressing issues?
Yeah, the so my general attitude about game design, and I'm going to answer a question that was not asked, but then I'll get back to talking about Matrix games. Um, there's a question that gets asked of me occasionally, which says, how is it ever too soon to work on a game? Is it ever too close to the historical, to our own moment to design a game about it? Which is a very it's a silly question to even pose in this forum because I think everyone on this call knows that games can't be too soon, they can only be too late. Like games are tools for understanding moments, and there is no moment as important as our present moment because that's the moment that saves lives. Um, for that reason, the more complex models can be dangerous because they take a long time to design. And sometimes leaning on the existing expertise of a set of players through a matrix game is going to just be a lot more effective, like pound for pound. I think Matrix games have just significant advantages when it comes to understanding the present, anything that's still very active, where we haven't had a lot of good scholarly work that's built it out. Um, that being said, they miss things because Matrix games are fundamentally only as good as their participants. So if I were doing a Matrix game of the Pacific Theater, I would do a very bad job. And if I sit down to play Mark Herman's Empire of the Sun, his voice is there guiding my harebrained schemes and stopping them from happening. And that's their great advantage. And so, I mean, some of this has to do with the strength of the author function in a game. And I think, if you are in a position where you have a fundamental statement that you want to make that is either a reflection of your own expertise or of some core insight, that's a place where you're working in traditional game forms. And if instead you are trying to reach some kind of consensus about action with a bunch of people with similar skill sets, but a lot of uncertainty, then a matrix game is really appropriate. So I don't see them in strict hierarchy. I don't get to work or play matrix games because they're outside of my immediate area, although I have done them in the past. I think they're incredible tools.
So the next one comes from Sam. How do you feel about modern perspectives on influence the kinds of games and themes made today? For example, how do you see Root as a metaphor for the war in Afghanistan?
Uh, you know, I every couple of weeks someone sends me a note and asks me about uh or they don't ask me. They tell me that they've solved root and that it's actually about, you know, Gallic insurgents, or it's about Afghanistan, or it's about Vietnam. And I can't say that root isn't about something like Afghanistan. Like I came of age during the first like war on terror. And so of course insurgency is running in the back of my mind. And in fact, the first military histories I ever read were histories of insurgency. That's not an accident. That's the fact that I'm a high schooler in 2002 and 2003. And of course, those things are on my mind. Um, at the same time, Root is not designed for any specific historical parallel. And this has been a little tricky. So for example, we have a faction that we've been working on, that one of the designers has been working on at Leader, that is a diaspora, a people in diaspora. And I mean, of course, we're like thinking about the history of Israel right now because everyone is. And but we have to be careful that the faction is not too clearly modeled on any specific thing, because we want, like, I try to think about the root factions as representing precise but generalist geopolitical postures. And that if you look at, like, you know, one refugee community and another refugee community, there are going to be a lot of differences, but there are also going to be similarities, and the root factions are trafficking in the similarities. So critically, all of the root factions are not ideological, and that's the only ideological claim I'm making, is that a geopolitical posture or an attitude is going to determine more of your policy than the specifics of your ideology. And that, of course, is an ideological statement itself. Um, but that's what root works in. It works in metaphor and allegory.
That's funny because I always say when I play Root that Root is just furry Afghanistan in so many ways.
Well, maybe it's
Right.
for Vietnam.
Yeah. And like you said, like I grew up in the age of the GWOT and the global war and terror, so I project my own experiences onto the game, which is always interesting to see. Um, I'll wait for a few more seconds if there are any more questions, but I did get some other private questions here that I'll read out, which is what how do you decide what is the most salient or important decisions for players when you're looking from your perspective, right? Like among all the choices they have, how do you hone in on the story or the key decision point that you want to focus on?
This is a really good and hard question, because I wish I could tell you that there was this recipe that I had. You know, sometimes I used to say that when I was working on design, I would be thinking about a bunch of interesting situations and kind of problematics. And then I would also be thinking about me some kind of mechanical innovation. And that every once in a while, I would find a situation and a mechanical innovation that complemented each other. And it was at that collision that the game would come. And that did happen with Pax Pamir. Because with Pamir, I was like, okay, how do you tell the story of the great game? Is it a story about state formation? How do you do a game about state formation? That's kind of weird. Like, you could make it like a Euro, but that's not really capturing it right. So that was happening in one chamber. And then the other chamber, I was thinking, could you build a tableau builder where the more you built the tableau, the more intertwined the player positions got? And that's because in tableau builders, and I'm talking about games like Race for the Galaxy, any game where you have, or even heck, I could use Ark Nova or Terraforming Mars, any game where you have a set of cards in front of you, as you get more cards, you become more independent of other players and of the luck of the draw. You are becoming independent. I'm like, well, that's not how state formation works. State formation is about becoming more dependent. And as soon as I realized, like, oh, these two things are connected, and that's where the game starts emerging. Um, with John Company, it's funny, you know, I was telling someone once that when I'm doing research for a game, I'm not trying to like do a whole book. I'm not saying, ah, yes, John Key's The Honorable Company, this would be a great game. Instead, there's like a paragraph, there's like a moment where I'll read like a little flash of something, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's a game. I can see the whole game. And for John Company, it came from reading I was reading Thackeray's The Newcomes, which is an old 19th century novel in Vanity Fair. And and I was thinking about Becky Sharp playing Cat's Cradles with Joseph Sedley, who's this you know, East India Company kind of clerk writer character. And they're playing this game. I'm like, there's something about the company and the domestic and the London season marriage market, and also like the wealth that's being brought in. They're all tangled together. And then I read Said's book, Literature and Imperialism, which was kind of like a follow-up to Orientalism that he wrote in the early 90s. And he has a reading of Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, which reads Jane Austen's dramas through the lens of the wealth created by empire. And I was like, that's it. That's the game. That's like, look at empire from the perspective of the manners back in England. And the whole game then starts like folding out of that same thing. So there's no recipe. You just like read widely and then you look for connections where you can find them. And there has to be something provocative. There's always like a little edge to it that feels like underserved by the current market is the other thing. I mean, with the great game with Pamir, I was kind of upset that there was no games on the subject of the great game, and so that I was also feeling that pushing me, or with the game that's coming out soon, Arcs. I really wanted a science fiction game that just didn't feel like I was playing Masters of Orion. I wanted something that felt different, and so it's sort of the intersection of all those little elements.
So we have a long question, which I'll try to condense and simplify, which is often like war games are often categorized by their tiers of perspective, like, you know what I mean, tactical, squad, operational, strategic, and so forth. And when you look at conflict-driven schemas, or, you know what I mean, for your games that are not particularly focused on conflict themselves, like John Company, right? Do
Mhm.
you always strive to leverage sort of a novel approach, sort of a storytelling approach, like you mentioned, or are there other frames of comparison might you invoke to characterize the perspective you spoke about in historical games like Pax Pamir and Infamous Traffic?
So is this question specifically about modeling conflict, or is it more general?
I
It's
think
not a
it's a
thing.
bit more general
Sure.
in the sense that often, you know what I mean, war games are typically designed by the echelon that you're looking at the problem
Yep.
at, right?
Yep. Yep.
The commander, right? And I think this one is more asking is like, what are other perspectives in which you can use those for those games about
Right.
historical perspectives beyond conflict?
Yeah, I understand. So I'll use John Company again as an example. Uh, John Company is interested in how an institution operates, and that's because it is a key it's a key actor. Institutions are key actors in our history, but they don't behave like nation states. And individuals are important actors in our history, but they also don't behave like nation states. And so I think, I had an economics professor once who always said that, the kind of fundamental sin of the discipline of economics is that it too often assumes um, that all markets are composed of what gets called the economic man. And what that does is it hides the fact that, so if I run to the store after this call and go get a gallon of milk for my family, I'm not behaving totally as a rational actor. I'm behaving as someone who has to take care of some kids and I have different responsibilities. A church that is buying paper towels for some kind of church function is not behaving like an economic man. They're behaving like a small institution. And so, any one of those perspectives, there are things that could be teased out in the game form. History is filled with odd little structures like this that are I think, worth thinking about. Um, when it comes to mechanical design, I find myself, I'm very much like a mechanics last designer, but I'm not necessarily theme first. Usually what happens is the theme and something that I sometimes call like the system emerge at the same time. And by the system, I mean the relationship between the different actors. That's the system. And so what I'm trying to look for in a mechanism is some kind of way to formalize that relationship. I actually think that the coin games, Voko Runka's coin games, are really good at this. There are things that they are less good at, which is I think they struggle when it comes to the that like level of simplicity and intuitiveness that allows you to hold their action menus in your head. But I think that is an okay price to pay because what they're giving you is really robust and interesting interactions at a system level between all the asymmetric positions that are being designed not because they're simple or easy or catchy, they're being designed to produce a certain kind of tension. And so, whenever I'm working on a combat system, I will oftentimes start by typing up like, this is the system, these are the kind of outputs it needs to produce. And then when it comes to the actual mechanism, well, it's anything. It's anything that I can possibly like put together in a coherent way. Um, and this is, I mean, I guess this is like a slightly frustrating answer because there isn't a guiding logic to what I'm doing. But except for the fact that it has to make sense it has to produce the systemic interactions that I'm wanting to see.
So I want to thank you, Cole, for spending your Tuesday evening with us. I appreciate it. I always learn a lot whenever we talk about games and so forth. And for those who have other questions, I'd love to get to all of them. And I think, was it, hold on, one last question
All right,
popped in.
fire away.
You stated previously that you don't include variants in your games. Is that because you like that you feel like they warp the story you're trying to tell, or because the mechanics and stories are so interrelated?
Uh, Neither, although those are good reasons to not like variants, but neither. So I don't like variants because I think they fragment the discourse around a game. And this is because as a player, I used to play a lot of Twilight Imperium. And back in the days of the third edition of Twilight Imperium, there was no consensus about the best way to play Twilight Imperium. And it was because the core version of Twilight Imperium was plainly not the best version. And the expansions that were released introduced like 10 variants, and you could just kind of pick whichever one. And whenever you would sit down to go to a new city and you're going to play with Twilight Imperium with strangers, they were playing a different game. And it also meant that there could be no discourse around the game. And I come from a background in literary studies and you need to agree what the text is you're talking about before you can talk about the text. So my attitude about variants generally is I want to shut them down because there is a text and you can talk about the text and you can engage with it and it allows a much more robust discourse to happen. And I'll give a very specific like example. Uh, for Root, there are a couple tournament changes for the people who play Root in competitive settings. There are a few little balances that are agreed upon by the community as improving Root. And the community is right. They do. As a company, we are very hesitant to put those changes in because we don't want people to be like, which version of Root are you playing? However, we will eventually find a way to fold those changes in and hopefully like get everybody on, Root 1.1 or whatever. And they are thankfully small enough changes. But no, it's entirely because of the discourse around the game, which is of course because I do think that the mechanics and the story are so interwoven, and there's a reason why the game is the way it is. Another very small example: when I was working on John Company, I proposed a hypothetical variant for allowing the players to have more control over their retirement roles. But I said at the same time, like, this is not an official variant. This will never be in a rule book. And it's because it's not the correct way to play the game. And I meant that both in terms of the story the game's trying to tell and for the discourse that emerges around the game.
So now we one day have to sit at a table and play Twilight Imperium and see which variant we are playing.
Yes, that's
Uh,
exactly right. Well, the fourth edition has saved us all.
Yes. Um, so again, I want to thank you for spending your Tuesday evening with us. I really appreciate it. I always learn a lot, and it's always good to see how other designers view games differently, but also view games the same, right? I relate to how you said there's a moment, right, that something hits you when you read something, that a story arises and you're like, this is the story I want to tell, this is the decision I want to explore. At the same time, you have some notion, some vague notion of a mechanic or system that you want to explore it with. So thank you again. Thank you for our participants and guests in the audience for asking such wonderful questions and always being such supportive, engaging members of our society. And thank you again, Cole. I appreciate it. And any last comments?
Not at all. Thank you all for hosting me. It was lovely to give this talk.